Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. Later in the show, I'll be joined by Dalia, Gebrial, and coming up later tonight, we'll be speaking about Britain's crowded prisons ahead of one proposal from Labour that could see many prisoners released this summer. We look at the hypocrisy from Keir Starmer when it comes to atrocities in Ukraine and Gaza this week, and Kwarteng has been blasted in a Newsnight appearance. Is it a portend of what's to come for Tory politicians as they look for careers after a catastrophic general election? Keir Starmer is today on his first international trip, attending a summit to mark the 75th anniversary of NATO. Now, he's presumably pretty happy to attend this event in his first week, given he made Labour's cast iron commitment to NATO a key plank of his election campaign. This is exactly where he wants to be. And he repeated that message about cast iron commitments before taking off to Washington last night.
I'm pleased to have the early opportunity to affirm and reaffirm Labour's strong support, unshakable support for NATO. We're a founding member. It's now the 75th anniversary, but this is an opportunity to send that message in relation to Russian aggression wherever. But that attack last week was appalling, and so the message is even more important now than it was before. The most important thing at the moment is to, at this NATO summit, recommit to our solidarity with and standing with Ukraine and discuss the practical plans for further action that we can take together in relation to Russian aggression.
Today, Starmer had his first bilateral meeting with Olaf Scholz, that's the German Chancellor. Later today, he'll have a one-on-one meeting with Joe Biden. Now, Biden is, of course, currently facing pressure to stand aside as the presidential candidate for later this year due to concerns about his cognitive condition. But opening the summit last night, he tried to project an image of Western power.
My friends, it's good that we're stronger than ever, because this moment in history calls for our collective strength. Autocrats want to overturn global order, which is by and large kept for nearly 80 years and counting. Terrorist groups continue to plot evil schemes to cause mayhem and chaos and suffering. In Europe, Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine continues, and Putin wants nothing less than Ukraine's total subjugation, to end Ukraine's democracy, to destroy Ukraine's culture, and to wipe Ukraine off the map. And we know Putin won't stop at Ukraine, but make no mistake, Ukraine can and will stop Putin.
The key theme of the summit is to try and rally Western support behind Ukraine. And part of that involves the delivery of F-16 fighter jets. Volodymyr Zelensky tweeted this today: "I am grateful to the United States, Denmark and the Netherlands for taking practical steps to achieve the goal of all Ukrainians to strengthen the Ukrainian Air Force with F-16s. I am grateful to Belgium and Norway for their commitment to providing us with their F-16 jets. This is a clear signal that Russia's ability to terrorize Ukrainian people, cities and communities will continue to reduce. F-16s will also be used to bolster Ukraine's air defense. I am confident that they will assist us in better protecting Ukrainians from brutal Russian attacks, such as this week's strike on the Okhmedit Children's Hospital in Kyiv." And we'll be talking about that strike later in the show. I think that's what Keir Starmer was referring to in the clip we showed you as well. To discuss the significance of this NATO summit, earlier today I spoke to Lily Lynch. Lily Lynch is a foreign affairs writer based in Belgrade who's written extensively on NATO. And I began by asking her if this is a good time for our new Prime Minister to be hitching themselves to the NATO wagon.
It's a very interesting time to be hitching yourself to the NATO wagon, as there's a really important presidential election in the United States in November, which will really determine, I think, in many ways, the future of NATO and which direction it goes, and how how big of an alliance it is and how much the United States is committed to it. Of course, Trump has in the past made these very for a lot of people, alarming statements about how he would like to see the United States pull out of NATO. There's some private comments he's made. And of course, he's also accused some member states of freeloading. So I think that to answer your question, we don't really know what a NATO alliance will look like under a new Trump administration, if that's what happens. Certainly as it exists today, it's a very tense time in Europe with a war in Ukraine. So we'll just have to see. It's a very uncertain time in the world and for NATO too.
And presumably that's going to be the big elephant in the room, like the possibility of a Trump presidency, because, you know, as far as I understand from the speech, is sort of this NATO summit, obviously it's to sort of celebrate an anniversary, but it's also to project an image of unity in the face of Russia. So sort of everyone's saying, Biden's saying, you know, this is the strongest NATO's ever been. New people want to join it, Sweden and Finland, of course. And sort of this argument that it's as strong as ever, we can beat Putin. I'm presuming that behind the scenes, everyone's saying, you know, this guy, President Biden, there's currently a huge push within his party for him to not even be the candidate because everyone thinks he's got cognitive decline. That means that Donald Trump is the favorite to be the American president in, you know, November, or I suppose they get inaugurated in January, don't they? So what are we even doing here is what I kind of imagine them all thinking. How can you possibly make a commitment as NATO when the most important role in that organization might sort of just completely flip and have a fundamentally different position?
You're absolutely right. It's a bizarre thing. I think that a lot of the European member states are sort of avoiding the elephant in the room. There's some, you know, there are people writing editorials. I'm sure there are behind the scenes conversations, but I don't see a lot of kind of public discussions among, you know, political leaders in Europe about what will happen if, say, Trump is president again. As far as Biden goes, I think that his cognitive state and evaluating that has kind of taken over the summit. Last night I watched him speak, and it was a better performance than he gave during the June 27th debate, which was obviously a complete disaster. He was better, but it was still not good. He spoke much more clearly, but there were definitely points where he was very muddled, and you couldn't hear what he was saying. He was modulating the volume in a kind of awkward way that seemed kind of arbitrary. It was a very strange kind of speech, but he did okay. I'm a little bit more concerned about the last day of the summit. So on Thursday, he'll be giving a press conference with Zelensky, and that will be without a teleprompter, presumably. So that should be, you know, kind of make a lot of people much more nervous. I know the European kind of allied countries and NATO have, or kind of sounding the alarm about Biden's cognitive decline like much earlier this year, and were kind of ignored by the Biden administration. Biden apparently referred to Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl, two politicians who've been dead for years, when he was speaking about recent conversations that he was having with his counterparts in Europe. So they've been noticing that there's been some problems for a very long time. So I'm assuming that behind the scenes, there's a lot of anxiety. There's obviously a lot of there's an imperfect unity as well. I think that the Secretary General and Biden have done their best to sort of project the image, like you said, of a united front. But of course, there are member states like Hungary who are very queasy about the idea of committing to any kind of NATO troops in Ukraine, and there are some other states, Bulgaria and Slovakia, who are also kind of unsure about the current path pursued by NATO as a whole. So, yeah, it's kind of an uncertain time. And but the biggest question is certainly the American presidency.
And in terms of Ukraine, so obviously I think Biden yesterday sort of announced some form of new commitment, help with air defense. Obviously, that wouldn't be American sort of planes shooting Russian planes out of the sky, but sort of equipment and such like. I know today there's been talk of more F-16s to Ukraine. Is this sort of the sign of a genuine commitment by the West to say, look, I know it seems like there's been a deadlock and lots of people are questioning whether it's time for Zelensky to try and sue for peace. Not necessarily that, you know, Putin would offer him that. It's not necessarily a form of agency Zelensky has. But do you see NATO as saying, no, let's double down. Let's give Ukraine more weapons and try and win this war? Or is this sort of all talk? Is this projection?
I think you see consistently this gap between rhetoric and policy. So, of course, you know, these new commitments about air defense and F-16s. These are things that Ukraine's been asking for a very long time. They were discussed even the last summit in Vilnius. But the way you hear about this war, the way you hear Biden talk about this war, the way you hear leaders in Europe talk about this war, this sort of war, for Western values and for democracy against authoritarianism. These are very it sounds like the stakes are very, very high, right? But at the same time, you see much more kind of tentative actions being taken. Of course, these commitments, these military kind of commitment of equipment, will be significant for Ukraine, but it's certainly, I don't think it's enough to turn the tables, completely. It's not enough to completely, reverse what's happened and give the Ukraine the upper hand. And I think so. It's a really, really kind of seems like a kind of intermediate kind of measure, kicking the can down the road, really.
And let's talk about NATO more generally. This is the 75th anniversary. I'm not a historian, but that seems like a fairly long time for a military alliance to survive. NATO's obviously had a lot of doubters, especially since the end of the Cold War. I mean, has it proven those doubters wrong? It's not just surviving; it's also expanding.
This is a Cold War bloc, so of course, founded in 1949 to confront the Soviet Union as a security and political bloc. At the end of the Cold War, there were a lot of very rich conversations. Should NATO continue to exist? Because deprived of its antagonists, what's the purpose? So, of course, the people who said that NATO should still exist won out, and perhaps for the worse. I think that would have been the moment for NATO to cease to exist. But it continued to expand eastward. And in 1999, that would have been the 50th anniversary, I suppose, of the alliance. Last time it was in Washington. Before this year, you had, of course, the summit took place against the backdrop of the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. So, in 1995 and in 1999, the NATO alliance took action against Serbs, first in Bosnia and then in Kosovo, to halt some atrocities being committed there. So, this so-called humanitarian intervention certainly gave the alliance sort of a new life in a way, and breathed new life into it. It seemed for many supporters of it, but of course, very quickly, within a decade or a little over a decade, you had interventions in Libya, which were quite disastrous. Which really called into question the entire, sort of idea of humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect, all these ideas that kind of grew out of the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia. And then, of course, that kind of brings us up to the war in Ukraine. And as you probably are well aware, there's quite a lot of debate about what caused this war. Does NATO exist to manage problems created by its own existence? Or, was Russia's sort of aggression, say, inevitable, and NATO now a valiant protector of small states in Europe? It really is it's really a big question of our time. And of course, there's a whole new dimension now that will become even more pressing if Trump takes the helm, which there are many people who would like to see NATO expand more into Asia and the Indo-Pacific. And already you see in the last few years, you're now seeing Asian leaders invited to NATO summits for the first time. And you see kind of China identified as a problem for the first time in some of these communiques that are coming out. So definitely, it's a very pivotal moment for NATO.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, because one of the big debates about sort of Keir Starmer and Labour's foreign policy is whether Britain's defence policy or war policy, whatever you want to call it, should be focused on sort of core defence priorities, which is essentially Europe. We're in Europe, or whether we should be sort of committing to East Asia and the Pacific, which I think Boris Johnson sort of had delusions of grandeur. He sort of wanted us to be this global power. In NATO, I imagine, just as there are debates on the left, is this an offensive or a defensive organization? Is this protecting Europe, or is this trying to have sort of strategic domination spanning the globe, containing the enemies of the West? I assume within the organization, there are also different factions who want it to focus on different things. Is it sort of a black box, what goes on in there? Or can we talk sort of meaningfully about there being parts of NATO that want it to be defensive and parts of NATO that wants it to be offensive?
I would certainly like to hear more about those discussions that happen behind the scenes. I'm sure they're very interesting. And we see some of these. We see people who say, I support the existence of NATO, but think that it should be leaner. It should not be this bloated kind of thing that is always gluttonously expanding around the globe. There are variations in thinking, and of course, the most kind of extreme example of that is Hungary, who will not. There's an agreement now, just as of last month, that Hungary will not block any aid going to Ukraine, but in exchange for the assurance that they would not have to participate in any kind of military operation in Ukraine. So you do see these kind of small fissures in the alliance for sure, but it is. I would say that overall, though, what's fascinating, you mentioned the left, there's been a shift, and you see this in the Nordic countries, especially, the Social Democrats, who used to be very sort of anti-war and not Atlanticist at all, now embracing NATO. Both the Social Democrats in Sweden and in Finland were in power when NATO, when they opted to become members of NATO, when they decided that. So you really see this move within, say, the center left in Europe to, fully embrace NATO. And when we're talking about NATO, it's important to kind of understand what we're talking about. It's like we're talking about really, U.S. say dominance in Europe, right? That's kind of what it's about. So there's the famous saying, NATO exists to keep the U.S. in, Russians out, and the Germans down. So that's really what we're talking about here. And of course, with the U.S., when its role in the world is kind of in question because of our domestic politics in America, you really that means a lot of kind of existential questions for NATO too.
That was Lily Lynch speaking to me earlier today. The world has this week witnessed 2 acts of aggression by powerful states against innocent children. In Kyiv on Monday, a Russian airstrike hit part of a children's hospital. 2 people were killed, both of them adults, but many children were put at risk and presumably left traumatized. The bomb was part of a broader round of airstrikes that, according to Ukrainian authorities, killed 36 and injured 140. To this act of aggression, responses were quick. The attack led news bulletins, and Britain's new Prime Minister tweeted this: "Attacking innocent children, the most depraved of actions. We stand with Ukraine against Russian aggression. Our support won't falter." Keir Starmer is, of course, right. Attacking innocent children is the most depraved of actions, which means he should also have been outraged by a different set of events that took place 2,000 kilometers away in Gaza. On Tuesday afternoon, Palestinian children were playing football outside a school in the town of Abasan, east of Khan Yunis, when an Israeli airstrike hit the compound. The airstrike hit the tents of families who had been sheltering in the school. Officials at the nearby Nasser hospital said on Wednesday that 31 people, including 8 children, had been killed and more than 50 people were wounded. This atrocity was reported in the Western press, but with none of the prominence accorded to the bombing of a hospital in Kyiv, in which no children were killed. And there was no statement from Keir Starmer. Dalia, it's really interesting. I think it's very obvious to so many people watching this, the fact that you've got these 2 terrible conflicts taking place at the same time. So Russia's war on Ukraine and Israel's war on Gaza. And we are just seeing such a different response, both from the press and from our politicians.
What we can see in the kind of fallout from this is, I think, a perfect exemplification of the fact that what has been normalized over the past 9 months is not in fact normal. This idea that war crimes can be conducted before our very eyes, and the best that the powerful in the international community can do is issue cautious, lukewarm statements to routinely ignore the assessments and judgments of otherwise reputable international institutions, to constantly add qualifications, to constantly hide behind this idea of it being complicated, as if there's some kind of nuanced and highly intelligent reason why war crimes can't be not only condemned but stopped as they are happening. We have been told that that's normal, that it's normal for that to happen. It's normal for us to be watching hospitals getting bombed and for people in power to be seemingly unable to even condemn it in black and white terms. And so what we are seeing in this case is that actually it's very easy for the low bar of outright condemnation and further action to be taken. I think that if Russia came out and said, oh, no, it was actually the Ukrainian army that bombed their own hospital, I don't think that would be taken with any kind of credibility in the way that similar claims made by the Israelis with Al Ahli Baptist Hospital quite early on into the genocide were taken seriously by our press and by politicians as well. And there is a temptation, it's been a long time now that we have seen a double standard between the treatment of Ukrainians and the treatment of Palestinians, between the treatment of Ukrainian refugees, for example, and refugees from other parts of the world. And it's very tempting to point out that this is a racist double standard, that somehow because Ukrainians look white, they are being treated differently to people from Palestine, or in the case of refugees, people from Syria, from Afghanistan, etc. And it's definitely true that when a community is racialized, it's far easier to dehumanize them, to treat them as disposable. But I think that there's just something to add to that analysis in terms of nuance, which is that the fact that Ukrainians are being treated as white in this instance is not an inherent fact about Ukrainians, but rather it is because the defense of Ukrainians at this moment aligns with the goals of Western foreign policy. And that is why they have been coded as innocent, which is closely related to the category of white, whereas Palestinians exist in antithesis to Western foreign policy interests, to the geopolitical interests of the hegemons, the global hegemons. And that is almost why they have been coded outside of this category of innocence. So yes, racialization and racial disparity plays a part in this. And certainly the fact that Palestinians are racialized as brown and Muslim creates this shorthand to their dehumanization. But it's very important to realize that there is a material basis to this differential racialization, because I'm sure that, 5 years ago, the same, people who are talking about the need to defend Ukraine, the need to protect Ukrainians, the innocence of Ukrainians would in the same breath decry Eastern European migrants as being inherently different to migrants from other parts of Europe. So I think that kind of understanding of how power balances and power interests shape who gets to be defended, who gets to be protected, who gets to be included in protected categories, helps us to understand why there is such a different valuation on the life of Ukrainian people and the life of Palestinians.
As a former director of public prosecutions, Keir Starmer likes to remind the British public that he has a history of locking up criminals. But as Prime Minister, one of the first decisions he needs to make is whether or not to release thousands of them. This is a decision that's been forced on Starmer. So before the general election, prison governors warned that British prisons would reach full capacity within days of a new government taking office. The problem was caused by the Tory government sending more people to prison than there were spaces. And their failure to tackle the crisis was well known. Last week, the president of the Prison Governors Association told the Financial Times this: the Conservative government has known about this for ages, There are things they could have done and didn't right up until the election was called. They made it inevitable that someone else would have to make very difficult decisions. Those difficult decisions have now been handed to the new Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood. She will now consider plans to automatically release prisoners that have served just 40% of their sentence. That proposal is just one of several being looked at by the Ministry of Justice to address prison overcrowding. Sources have suggested the scheme would exclude offenders jailed for sex crimes, violence, or terrorism. But if the Tories were trying to save up bad headlines for a new Labour government, they appear to have got their way. This is not a Daily Mail headline Starmer will embrace in the first week in office. So this is up to 40,000 convicts could be freed after serving just 40% of sentences under Labour plan to ease prison overcrowding. As Keir Starmer puts, reformer who believes only a third of lags should be behind bars in charge of jails. The reformer the Daily Mail is referring to is called James Timpson. He's the boss of the Timpsons chain of repair shops. Now, that chain intentionally employs lots of ex-convicts who Timpson believes have been screwed over by our prison system, as he explained in this now viral clip.
We're addicted to sentencing. We're addicted to punishment. So many of the people who are in prison, in my view, shouldn't be there. A lot should, but a lot shouldn't. And they're there for far too long. Far too long. And that's just getting worse and worse. In very crude terms, and you'll get people who completely disagree with me on this, we have 85,000 people in prison. It's going to go up to 100,000 pretty soon. A third of them should definitely be there. There's another third in the middle, which probably shouldn't be there, but they need some other kind of state support. A lot of them have got massive mental health issues. They've been in prison, in and out of prison all their lives. And then there's another third, and there's a large proportion of women. Prison is a disaster for them because it's just putting them back in the offending cycle.
Timpson's appointment as prisons minister has been celebrated by reformers, but it's also created an outcry among some quarters. In The Telegraph, the founder of the Public Safety Foundation has suggested Timpson might be the most dangerous man in Britain. And he wrote this: more than half of the prison population are there for violent or sexual offences, to say nothing of the burglars, robbers, knife carriers or drug traffickers that some are all too quick to erroneously classify as non-violent. We also know that nearly 2/3 of prison sentences were handed out to criminals with 7 or more previous convictions or cautions, with more than half going to criminals with 11 or more previous convictions. He says these are not individuals who made an honest mistake that we all might be guilty of. They are career criminals enabled to commit crime repeatedly and persistently by a sentencing regime built on the idea of endless second chances. Courts only intermittently deliver our best attempt at incapacitation for those who commit crimes, a prison sentence. Last year, those caught in crime with 15 or more previous convictions or cautions only had a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison. So he's someone who thinks that actually our prison system needs to get more strict, more people should be locked away, disagrees with Timpson that more people should be released. The domestic violence charity Refuge has also expressed concern about the idea of releasing thousands of prisoners on early release due to overcrowding. A spokesperson for the organisation said this: when considering options for the early release scheme, we need assurances from the government that those convicted of violence against women and girls offences will be exempt from this scheme and any further measures to tackle overcrowding. The Conservative government's early release system, like the one being considered by Labour, had been meant to exclude prisoners convicted of violent and sexual offences. But in May, the Chief Inspector of Prisons released a report showing that prisoners on early release included one man with a history of stalking and domestic abuse who was subject to a restraining order. And there have been recent high-profile cases where someone has been murdered by someone on parole. In June 2022, aspiring lawyer Zara Alina was brutally murdered after being followed as she walked home from an East London bar. Her killer, Jordan McSweeney, had been released from prison. Just 9 days earlier. He was freed on licence from a prison sentence for criminal damage, racially aggravated harassment, and unauthorised possession of a knife. McSweeney had 28 previous convictions for 69 offences, including burglary, assaults on police and members of the public, criminal damage, theft of motor vehicles, driving offences, offences committed while on bail, and shoplifting. When they were in opposition, Labour were also keen to point out these kind of tragic events weren't exactly rare. So in February last year, the party obtained official statistics, which they said showed offenders on probation were committing 3 murders or major sex crimes a week. They said Ministry of Justice figures showed that criminals have been convicted of nearly 700 murders while on probation since 2010, the equivalent of 1 a week. Dalia, this is clearly sort of a problem which was created by the Conservatives. If you put more people in jail than you have jail cells, then obviously you're going to get some kind of crisis like this. Labour aren't exactly going to welcome it. They seem to have some interesting thinkers who they've brought into government. This James Timpson guy seems like a very thoughtful fellow. He's got a very interesting background. I do also see why people are concerned, though, about sort of releasing lots of prisoners early. I mean, that statistic from Labour from a year ago, that 1 murder is committed every week by someone on parole. I didn't know that. And that seems kind of shocking. I mean, where do you stand on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what that statistic shows is something that a lot of us know, which is that prison doesn't work. If the metric for prison working is reducing harm in society, then the fact that, first of all, countries with the largest prison population per capita do not tend to be the most safe countries. You know, the United States has the largest prison population that has ever existed in human history, and it is per capita experiences the most violence and harm in terms of criminal acts in terms of all countries of comparable sizes and economies. If you look in South Africa, the most unsafe country in Africa when it comes to statistics on violent crime. And it has, again, the largest prison population per capita. So it's clear that if what you think prison does is resolve social problems, particularly when it comes to social harms, prison doesn't help. In fact, if anything, it's worse because it takes people who probably have already experienced trauma, have already been failed by systems, have already got, mental health issues perhaps, and it puts them in an extremely traumatizing, often violent and dehumanizing conditions. And then obviously when you then release people who then can't, struggle to then be accepted or reintegrated into society, that's not going to reduce the chances of harm. So to me, that statistic shows that a policy or an approach that looks to significantly reduce the prison population. I mean, I don't think that prisons really resolve any kind of problem, so I would like to not see any prisons. But at least in this moment that we're in, a move that is about massively reducing the prison population is more than not likely to make our societies safer. And I think for a lot of people, what prison actually does is it kind of scratches an itch or a need for retribution and revenge against people who have committed harms. Now, I can understand where that impulse might come from, but I don't think that that is the basis on which people should be locked in cages and dispossessed of some of the most fundamental human rights, especially when it comes to the knock-on social effects that having large prison populations has, what it does to us as a society. I think in this particular instance, again, obviously, it is good to see that we are moving from a government that is interested in just expanding the prison population in order to kind of tick the boxes of certain parts of the electorate who, again, I think are motivated primarily by that revenge impulse. Not all of them, but I think more often than not, because the statistics don't actually hold weight, that is what's being satisfied. I think it's good that we're going from that to someone who is actually the prison is not an answer to a lot of the problems that we think it's an answer for, and that there are actually lots of different things that can help us, when it comes to reducing harm and violence in our society. I think that's obviously, a step in the right direction. I don't think that I think still this idea that there are a third of people who are just born evil and have to be locked up is kind of, to me, quite a reductive way of looking at the world. I think that, if you think about the fact that the prison population has, nearly doubled since the 1990s, I don't think that that's because the number of people born with an evil defect in them has doubled. I think it's because our social environment and our social context, our economic context has changed, and our reliance on the prison system has increased. So, but obviously, it is a step in the right direction. I'm happy to see it. But I think it's also, that Daily Mail headline that you showed, where they tried to tie the fact that, prisoners are going to be released early with the fact that this, reformer, James Timpson, has been hired as part of Keir Starmer's cabinet. It's a sleight of hand there, right? Because they're not outright saying James Timpson is coming in, this new Labour hire is coming in and releasing prisoners onto the streets, which they know is going to activate a certain segment of the electorate and the population. They're saying, oh yeah, it's happening because of overcrowding, but also because Keir Starmer has hired this new, sort of the implication is liberal softy guy. And, this whole idea that Starmer laughably is somehow dangerous to the establishment is kind of is propagated there. But to me, what that says is that you don't govern by headlines, because even though this is a failure of the Conservatives, it's a failure of the fact that the Conservatives have gone for this incredibly carceral and punitive law and order program, which we always know the Conservatives are going to do, and without any kind of actually expanding infrastructure, therefore leading to this inevitable problem. Instead, what they're doing is they're twisting that kind of image to basically put it on this idea that Starmer is too left or too soft, which, the disciplinary effect of that is to try and pull Starmer even further to the right than he already is. So this is why you don't live and die by Daily Mail headlines, because even if you don't do what they say you're doing, they'll just make it up anyway, or they'll just frame it in a way that situates you like that anyway. So instead of trying to court the headlines of, the right-wing media, you might as well just do the things that are actually going to improve people's lives and just take, and let that record speak for itself. Because if you get guided by what will make a good Daily Mail headline, you'll end up neither making the Daily Mail happy, because they will never be happy with the Labour government, and you won't actually do the things that might actually improve people's lives and communities, which I believe significantly reducing, if not eliminating, the existence of a prison population would do.
I suppose, are you not at all worried? So if sort of half the prison population are there for violent or sexual offences, and if since 2010 there have been 700 murders by people on probation, are you not at all worried by the idea of sort of releasing lots of people from prison because the prisons are full? It doesn't seem like there's been a sort of rational decision there to say these people are completely safe to the public, therefore we're gonna release them. I mean, I very much come from a position, I don't believe in prisons for punishing people. I don't really believe in free will. I think sort of people are a product of their circumstance. I think the only argument, the strong argument for prison, because they also don't seem to rehabilitate people particularly well, the strong argument is that you remove dangerous people from society. And I think there are many people, you can find any explanation you want for why it's the case, but there are many people who are a danger to society, sort of, which is demonstrated by their actions. And if you've committed a bunch of sexual offences or a bunch of violent offences, I think probably it's better for society as a whole if you are taken away from society for potentially a considerable amount of time. I'm very much in favour of making prisons very nice for the people there, kind of Norwegian style, right? I don't want people to have a difficult time for the sake of punishing them. But I do actually quite strongly believe that there are some people who, for the well-being of everyone, probably do need to be removed from society. I mean, you disagree?
Because the logic of that, because prison makes people worse, because it's it denies people their freedoms, and that is a trauma. That is always going to be a trauma. There's no way to not make a denial of people's fundamental freedoms of mobility, freedoms to exist in society will not be a trauma. And so basically what you're arguing is that if you go to prison, or if you're a certain category of person and you go to prison, you should never be allowed to re-enter society because it will probably be worse for you in society. So you might as well just eliminate that entire population then.
Well, I mean, I think people are very inclined to sort of commit crimes when they're of a certain age. It's basically young men, right? So if you keep people in prison while they're young men, you can let them out when they're older. Obviously, it depends on the crime as well. But I think the idea of saying, oh, we can just create a society where people don't want to hurt each other and hope for the best, to me, that's a recipe for lots of people getting killed. I'd also sort of push back against this idea that obviously prison doesn't work because the places with the highest prison population also have the highest level of crime. Now, to me, you might be mixing cause and effect. Maybe they have higher prison populations because they also have high levels of crime as opposed to the other way around. Do you not think?
Well, I think that the counter to that is the fact that reoffending rates are so high, and that more often than not, it's people don't come out and reoffend. They often reoffend with more serious crimes, more serious, harmful crimes. And so that, to me, really supports the idea that whatever happens in these prisons is not conducive to healing for society or for the person who is in prison. And so, obviously there is no way to you can't put people into a petri dish and remove all control factors and see, what is left. But we can infer from these multiple proxies, both, in terms of reoffending rates, in terms of the relative in the relatively more higher rates of violence and harm in societies that have really big complex prisons, the fact that prison populations when prison populations increase in the same society, that also doesn't lead to a reduction in harm and violence. We can infer, and also from anyone who knows
crime has actually massively fallen while the prison population went up. There's obviously disagreements about cause and effect there, but
although anyone who knows someone that's been through the prison system and knows the way that it breaks someone down, these kinds of proxies we can use to infer. And also, to me, the kind of obvious fact that when you put someone in a cage, they're not going to come out and be like, yay, I'm so happy to be back into this society that put me into a cage. I feel like from those proxies, you can understand, you can kind of infer, it's the best inference that we have, that prison itself doesn't work.
I suppose the inference where I struggle with it as well is, so the man who killed Sarah Everard, I've suddenly forgotten his name. What was his name?
Wayne Couzens.
Wayne Couzens. So he started off with smaller crimes and he didn't go to prison for them. And then he went on to commit a very big crime. Now, if we'd say, oh, he flashed someone and then he went to prison and then he came out and killed someone, you could use your argument to say, well, he got worse in prison. But it might be that when people get sent to prison, they're often demonstrating a trajectory where they might go on to commit a more severe crime, just as Wayne Couzens did. So I just feel like, I think the left makes a bit of a mistake where essentially it's saying crime is only a societal problem, therefore we shouldn't put people away, because I think that will just make everyone very unsafe. I do feel like, you say you need to know someone who's in prison. I think also, knowing someone who's a victim of serious crime also probably is helpful.
Yeah, knowing someone who is a victim of serious crime, is also, and this is what I mean, I understand the feeling of when someone has committed harm, that there is a sense of well, it's not fair that they, because prison is the only framework of what justice can look like, that it is clearly the one that people reach for. It is what the victim of harm reaches for, because it's the only tool that we've been given. It's the only language that we've been given to think about what justice and restitution can mean. But I also think that if we are going to, and we can disagree on what this data tells us, but if it is the case that someone is not likely to be rehabilitated by prison, but is in fact likely to come out even more traumatized and even more inclined to do harm, then it doesn't make it better I don't think that it's better for a victim of a crime to feel like, okay, well, this person is going to go through a process that's going to mean that they're going to come out and be even more abandoned and even more marginalized and even more traumatized by society and likely to reoffend more intensively.
Should Wayne Couzens have gone to prison?
I mean, I don't think that Wayne Couzens should have had the power to do what he did anyway. But I guess for me, and this is where obviously prisons make society addicted to them, because there's a sense of okay, well, if we didn't put Wayne Couzens in prison, then what could we have done with him? And to me, it's until we can get out of this idea that prisons are a solution to violence and harm, I don't think that Wayne Couzens is going to become better because he went to prison.
No, but that's why we just need to remove him from society for a very long period of time.
Okay, but then we're going to argue, therefore, that okay, so you said that Wayne Couzens flashed someone, wasn't punished, or wasn't, I mean, he was I think he was there was like, didn't get completely over it, but he didn't go to prison for flashing someone. So does that mean that if someone flashes someone, we just lock them up forever because they might do something bad? Like but prisons make us addicted to them as a society because they negate all other ways of thinking about what harm is, why violence and harm happens, and what we can actually do to reduce the level of violence and harm in our society, and make and also offer that sense of justice and restitution for people who are victims of harm. Because let's also not forget, a lot of people who perpetrate harm are themselves often at some point in their lives victims of some kind of harm. So that line between perpetrator and victim is often quite blurry. But until we can start to really think about away from this idea of carceral and carceral punishment and actually look really deeply into why harm happens. Obviously, a huge reason why harm happens is because of inequality. It's because of bad mental health care. It's because we live in a society that is inherently violent, that is inherently harmful, and that expresses itself in these dysfunctional ways. But until we actually can sit and think about that, and we don't always have to reach to the prison to answer these problems, we're just going to keep reproducing the problem.
I suppose I just don't think people are necessarily fundamentally good. You know, I feel like in lots of situations, people are going to try and better their own situation, often by exploiting other people, potentially very violently.
I mean, I think that people are people, and there's a whole philosophical, spiritual conversation to be had about, like, is every person redeemable? Is every person, like, are people born good and evil? What does good and evil mean? But until I don't think that, like, we answer those deep spiritual questions, because I don't believe that people are born with a good chip or an evil chip. I believe that, you know, I don't have a theory for why, you know, certain kinds of violence happen. But I know that locking those people up in cages and denying them their freedoms, first of all, it never just ends with, you know, categorically definable harms and violence. It always bleeds outwards into other things. And that's why we always see people who have committed very menial things ending up in jail. But I know that that process of punishment, incarceration, detention, dispossession does not create a healthier society. And the fact that it has become the tool that we reach for so, you know, instinctively is something that's deeply broken about our society.
I mean, I'm definitely open to sort of saying, I'm open to what James Timpson is saying, actually, in terms of potentially it's the case that there could be a third of people in prison who could be released, a third of people who are somewhere in the middle, and a third of people who definitely need to be there. But I'm definitely of the position that a lot of people definitely need to be there. And I definitely think that people who are concerned about early release aren't being irrational or authoritarian. It might be because of genuine fear, because genuine harms have been caused.
I don't think they're being irrational or authoritarian. I think that we have been stuck in this loop where it's like, okay, we've not changed society one bit. We've made society, we live in a society that's quick to abandon people. It's quick to punish people. We've put people in cages, traumatized them, done violence to them. And then obviously, yes, you create a situation where if you're going to open the doors and then like just have nothing left out there for those people, then that feels like a kind of something that will feel scary. But that's only because the prison created that problem in the first place. And so, but let's agree that we'll start with where James Timpson is, and we'll resolve kind of those core problems of the ways in which our society enacts violence and dispossession amongst people, and then we'll see where we'll go from there.
Yeah, and also double check that the people who are getting early release aren't there for violent or sexual offences is what I would also add to the mix, but we might differ on that one. Unless
you're going to keep them in prison forever, which, some people might believe if you commit a violent crime, then you should just be locked up forever. But unless you're going to do that, unless you're going to do it forever, or you're going to, do the death penalty, then at some point you're going to have to release them back into society. So again, it's the prison that has created the conundrum that we're in today, not the idea that people shouldn't be in cages.
After Labour's landslide, there are a number of ex-Tory MPs looking for gainful employment. And one gig of choice is the TV interview. But how often might they face digs like this inflicted on Kwasi Kwarteng?
There's one other category which really counts, which is the big figure donors.
The donors, that's
and
right.
if they say to him,
It's not
look,
happening.
Joe, you're not the man for November, then that can make a big
And he's trying
impact.
to see that off by saying they're the elites.
Yeah.
But I think again, like we're here still talking about the same conversation and not thinking about the people who he's meant to represent as the electorate. And I think that increasing their living standards is what's important.
Agreed.
And if we're not actually pushing him to change policy that will actually address the needs of the American
But
people,
that's a
then
wider
what are we
political
talking
policy.
about?
I mean, that isn't related to his age. I mean, that's related to the political positions he's adopted. And I think any person who was the Democratic candidate would face exactly those pressures, because clearly Gaza is a huge issue, as it was here, in terms of the left coalition that they rely on to win the election.
Yeah, and I think I would just say then if we're going to replace Joe Biden with someone else, we're going to have the same policy issues, and we should still be putting pressure on, and that's important. And I think also that I'm not sure if we should be taking advice from someone who crashed the economy in a few days of being in the job as a councillor.
I know you want to do all that political stuff. We're here to have a broad discussion. But thank you anyway for reminding me of that.
To be fair, Michaela can say whatever she wants. And as you can in response.
And I can say whatever I want in response.
And can Derek, you too can say whatever you want as well.
That was the climate activist Michaela Loach questioning why Kwasi Kwarteng still felt he was a suitable person to be delivering political analysis. Dalia, I mean, it was a little bit rude, but was Loach in the right there?
I mean, someone had to say it because we're made to think that it's normal that someone who probably actually caused an economic crisis in this country. You know, he did the thing that the Conservatives accused Labour of doing. You know, the Conservatives came into power in 2010 and basically held Gordon Brown responsible for the global economy crashing. But actually, Kwasi Kwarteng actually did that. And that's not easy because, you know, Britain is a very protected economy. So it's not easy to tank our economy in such a specific and surgical way. It isn't normal that the person who did that is then allowed to kind of like become an authoritative voice on our media. But this kind of, it shows this ongoing problem that we have, which is this revolving door that politicians have between being MPs and then going on to be consultants, media figures, you know, writers, speakers, whatever, regardless of how they did in the actual job. You know, I'm thinking about on the other side of the Commons, John Ashworth, who, you know, lost his seat in Leicester East, has gone on to, you know, make some weird Islamophobic speculations about the guy who won the seat, the independent who won the seat, Shaukat Adam, and now has been promoted to the leader of Labour Together or Labour First, one of the big think tanks that is basically a key advisor of Starmer. And so it's like, okay, so you lost your democratic mandate. People didn't elect you in. You were one of the few Labour MPs to lose your seat in otherwise, you know, a pretty strong Labour election campaign. And yet there's this idea of like, but how could we possibly run a country without the expertise of John Ashworth? Like, he's entitled to have a say in how this country runs, despite the fact that he didn't get there by merit. He didn't get there by being elected. It's the same with Kwasi Kwarteng. I mean, with Kwasi Kwarteng, I actually think it's a less egregious example of that kind of failing upwards because, you know, he's not being promoted actually as someone with a say in government. He's just giving his opinion on TV. But it still does go to show how if you've been an MP, you know, an establishment MP in this country, you can do pretty much whatever you want other than try and bring socialism to the country or try and, you know, get rid of homelessness or, you know, fund the NHS. If you do that, then you are stigmatized to the hill. But you can do pretty much anything else and you have a hefty income for life ahead of you. And I think that's why a lot of people go into politics to begin with. It's a job for life. It's job security. It's one of the few lifelong job secure jobs that are left in this economy.
Well, I suppose there'll be quite a lot of MPs who lost their job last week who might say, actually, it wasn't a particularly secure job. And I think if you lose your position as an MP for a party that's just lost power, you're not necessarily the most employable person in the world. I think, you know, Michaela Loach she came across as articulate there. I suppose the reason why I'm a bit nervous about this is I remember after 2019 when sort of Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party had a bad election result, and then you had people like Aisha Hazarika sort of suddenly sort of rushing to Twitter and gloating and say, anyone who supported this project should never be allowed on television again. And, obviously if you're a Kwartengite, you would say, he wasn't necessarily wrong. He just misjudged the financial markets, or he was brought down by the Bank of England. He's still an interesting guy. And so I suppose trying to delegitimize people because they've failed at something could be a bit of a slippery slope. Am I being too concerned, Dalia? Should I lighten up a bit?
Well, I think that the difference between the two is that Corbyn didn't win an election. He lost an election. The policies that he put forward were actually quite popular amongst people. So, you can argue that in terms of his policy package, that was actually quite, a popular thing that people wanted to hear more from. But the difference is that Kwasi Kwarteng's failures destroyed many people's economic well-being and, in fact, many people's lives. And people in this country lost so much because of what Kwasi Kwarteng did to this economy that I don't know how people can stomach then him being presented and refuse to really take proper ownership of it. Liz trusts much more than Kwasi Kwarteng, but there's still this kind of sense of, the left wing IMF sabotaged us. But that I don't know how we, people who have lost what they lost as a result of that catastrophic budget, I don't know how they can really stomach switching on their TV and Kwasi Kwarteng being presented to them as, some kind of oracle of wisdom.
Yeah, I do agree. Most people watching the telly will think, because this is the guy who tried to help the rich and ended up increasing everyone's mortgages. Again, my only concern is I think if Jeremy Corbyn had won that election, the financial markets would have raised everyone's mortgage rates within about 48 hours. It would have been even quicker than when Liz Truss was Prime Minister. Obviously, but potentially. Obviously, that would have been to try and redistribute wealth as opposed to further concentrate it, which is what Truss and Kwarteng were trying to do. But yeah, I'm a bit uncomfortable with saying you failed at something, so you can never speak on television again. Well, because I want to go on television again, and I've failed at a bunch of stuff in my life. Dalia, thank you for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
And thank you, everyone, for watching this evening. Come back tomorrow night for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.